The morning sun cast long shadows across the marble floors of Buckingham Palace as Royal Guard Thomas Mitchell began his routine patrol. After 15 years of service, he knew every corner, every secret passage, and every sound that echoed through the ancient corridors. The palace had been unusually quiet since the Queen's passing 6 months ago, with staff moving like ghosts through rooms that once buzzed with royal activity. Thomas adjusted his red uniform and checked his watch. It was 9:30 a.m., and he was making his scheduled rounds through the private wing where the Queen's personal belongings were stored. These rooms had become almost sacred spaces, carefully maintained exactly as she had left them. Only a select few were allowed entry, and each visit was logged and monitored. As he approached the Queen's former private study, Thomas noticed something unusual. The heavy oak door, which should have been securely locked, was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of golden morning light escaped through the gap, creating a beacon in the otherwise dimly lit hallway. His trained instincts immediately went on high alert. Protocol demanded that these rooms remain sealed except during official visits with proper authorization. Thomas paused outside the door, listening carefully. He could hear the soft rustle of fabric and the gentle clink of what sounded like jewelry or small metal objects. Someone was definitely inside, moving around with purpose. His hand instinctively moved to his radio, but he decided to investigate first before raising any alarms. False alerts were career-ending mistakes in his line of work. Carefully, he positioned himself to peer through the narrow opening. What he saw made his breath catch in his throat. Queen Camilla stood with her back to the door, hunched over the Queen's personal jewelry collection. The afternoon light streaming through the tall windows illuminated dozens of precious pieces spread across the mahogany desk, pieces that Thomas recognized as some of the late Queen's most treasured personal items. These weren't the crown jewels kept in the Tower of London. These were intimate pieces. The pearl necklace the Queen wore to family gatherings, the simple gold bracelet that never left her wrist, the emerald brooch that had belonged to Queen Victoria. Each item held deep sentimental value and represented decades of royal history and personal memories. Camilla's movements were deliberate and careful as she examined each piece, holding some up to the light and placing others into what appeared to be a velvet-lined jewelry box. Thomas could see her profile now, and her expression was one of intense concentration, as if she was making careful selections based on specific criteria. The guard's mind raced with questions and concerns. While Camilla was now Queen, there were strict protocols governing the handling of the late Queen's personal effects. These items were supposed to be catalogued and distributed according to the Queen's will and royal tradition. Any changes or removals required documentation and approval from multiple parties, including the King himself. Thomas knew he was witnessing something significant, but he wasn't sure if it was authorized or not. The new Queen certainly had rights to royal jewelry, but the secretive nature of her actions and the early morning timing suggested this wasn't an official visit. The way she was selecting specific pieces rather than simply viewing the collection added another layer of concern. He remained frozen in position, torn between his duty to protect royal property and his reluctance to potentially embarrass or falsely accuse the Queen. His years of training had prepared him for many situations, but catching a member of the royal family in what might be unauthorized activity was not covered in any manual. The sound of approaching footsteps in the distant corridor made his decision for him. Thomas quickly stepped back from the door and continued his patrol route, but his mind was already formulating his next moves. He needed to document what he had seen and report it through proper channels, but he also needed to be absolutely certain of his facts before making any accusations. As he walked away, Thomas could still hear the soft sounds coming from the study. Whatever Queen Camilla was doing in there, she was taking her time and being very thorough about it. The implications of what he had witnessed would soon shake the very foundations of the palace, but for now, he needed to think carefully about how to handle this delicate and potentially explosive situation. The weight of this knowledge pressed heavily on his shoulders as he completed his morning rounds, knowing that his next actions could change everything for the royal family, and possibly end his own career in the process. Thomas Mitchell spent the rest of his shift wrestling with what he had witnessed. By the time his replacement arrived at 2 p.m., he had made his decision. The protocol was clear. Any unusual activity involving royal property must be reported to his immediate supervisor, regardless of who was involved. His loyalty was to the crown and the institution, not to any individual member of the royal family. After changing out of his ceremonial uniform, Thomas made his way to the security office located in the basement level of the palace. The windowless room buzzed with monitors showing feeds from hundreds of security cameras throughout the building. His supervisor, Chief Security Officer Margaret Hayes, looked up from her paperwork as he entered. Margaret was a stern woman in her 50s who had worked her way up through the ranks and commanded respect from everyone in the security detail. "Thomas, you look troubled. What's on your mind?" Margaret asked, setting down her pen and giving him her full attention. She had a reputation for being able to read people, and Thomas's expression clearly indicated he had something serious to discuss. "Ma'am, I need to report an incident from this morning's patrol. It involves Queen Camilla and the late Queen's personal effects." Thomas began, choosing his words carefully. He could see Margaret's eyebrows rise slightly, indicating he had her complete attention. Thomas recounted exactly what he had seen, providing precise times and detailed descriptions of Camilla's actions. Margaret listened without interruption, occasionally making notes on a pad. When he finished, she sat back in her chair, clearly processing the implications of what she had heard. "You're absolutely certain about what you saw? The specific pieces she was handling?" Margaret asked, her voice betraying no emotion. She had dealt with sensitive situations before, but nothing quite like this involving such high-ranking royals. "Completely certain, ma'am. I recognize several of the pieces from previous security briefings about the collection. The pearl necklace alone is worth over £200,000, not to mention its historical significance," Thomas replied confidently. Margaret pulled out a thick folder from her desk drawer, the official inventory of the late Queen's personal jewelry collection. The document had been compiled immediately after the Queen's death and was supposed to serve as the definitive record of every piece. She flipped through several pages before finding what she was looking for. According to this inventory, compiled by the Royal Collection Trust, every piece should still be in the study. Nothing has been officially moved or redistributed yet. The King's private secretary told me just last week that they were still working on the final arrangements for distribution according to the Queen's wishes, Margaret explained, her concern growing more evident. She reached for her secure phone, the red one used only for the most sensitive communications within the palace. "I need to contact the King's private secretary immediately. The situation requires immediate clarification and possibly investigation." As Margaret dialed, Thomas felt a mixture of relief and anxiety. He had done his duty by reporting what he saw, but he also understood that his actions might have serious consequences for everyone involved. If Queen Camilla was acting within her rights, he could face disciplinary action for causing unnecessary alarm. If she wasn't, the scandal could rock the monarchy. The conversation with the King's private secretary lasted nearly 20 minutes. Margaret's side of the conversation consisted mainly of listening, with occasional responses of "I understand" and "Yes, sir." When she finally hung up, her expression was grave. "The situation is more complicated than we thought," Margaret said, turning back to Thomas. "The King's private secretary confirms that no official authorization has been given for anyone to remove items from the collection. Furthermore, he was under the impression that Queen Camilla was attending a charity event in London this morning, not visiting the palace." Thomas felt his stomach drop. This meant that not only was Camilla's presence unexpected, but her actions were potentially unauthorized. The implications were staggering. They were possibly looking at theft of royal property by the Queen herself. "What's our next step, ma'am?" Thomas asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. "We need to immediately verify the current status of the collection and document any missing pieces. I'm assembling a small team of trusted staff to conduct a discreet inventory. We also need to review all security footage from this morning to create a complete record of events," Margaret replied, already reaching for additional files. "And Queen Camilla?" Thomas asked hesitantly. "That's above our pay grade now. The King's private secretary is handling that aspect personally. Our job is to gather facts and present them accurately. Let the royals sort out the family drama," Margaret said firmly. As they began to organize the investigation, both Thomas and Margaret understood that they were potentially at the center of a scandal that could dominate headlines worldwide. The next few hours would determine whether this was a simple misunderstanding or something far more serious that could shake the very foundations of the modern monarchy? The palace, which had been quiet all morning, was about to become the center of a storm that would test the loyalty, discretion, and integrity of everyone involved. Within an hour of Thomas's report, a carefully selected team of 3 senior staff members had assembled in the late Queen's study. Margaret Hayes led the group, accompanied by Sarah Chen, the palace's head curator, and James Morrison, the official photographer who documented all royal collections. Each person had signed additional confidentiality agreements before entering the room. The study felt heavy with history and tension as they began their work. Sarah opened her laptop and pulled up the digital inventory, while James prepared his camera equipment. Margaret stood guard at the door, ensuring their privacy while they conducted what could potentially be the most important audit in recent royal history. Let's start with the items. Thomas specifically mentioned seeing in Queen Camilla's hands, Sarah suggested, her voice barely above a whisper despite their privacy. She located the entries for the pearl necklace, gold bracelet, and emerald brooch on her screen. They moved methodically to the jewelry display cases that lined one wall of the study. The first case, which should have contained the pearl necklace, was immediately concerning. The custom-shaped velvet indentation where the necklace normally rested was empty. Sarah checked her inventory 3 times before looking up with a troubled expression. The 3-strand pearl necklace is definitely missing. According to our records, it was a wedding gift to the late Queen and has an estimated value of £250,000, Sarah reported, making notes on her tablet. James photographed the empty space, ensuring the timestamps and metadata would provide irrefutable evidence of when the discovery was made. Margaret felt her stomach tighten as she realized this was no longer a potential misunderstanding. They were dealing with actual missing royal property. They continued their systematic check, moving from case to case. The situation grew worse with each discovery. The gold bracelet that had belonged to Queen Victoria was missing from its designated spot. The emerald brooch that the late Queen had worn to countless state functions was nowhere to be found. In total, they discovered 7 pieces missing from the collection. "This is unprecedented," Sarah whispered, her hands shaking slightly as she updated her digital records. "These aren't just valuable pieces. They're irreplaceable historical artifacts. Some of these items have been in the royal family for over a century." Margaret's secure phone buzzed with an encrypted message from the king's private secretary. After reading it, she looked even more concerned than before. "I've been instructed to expand our investigation. We need to check the guest wing where Queen Camilla stays when she visits the palace." The team exchanged worried glances. Searching the Queen's private quarters was an extraordinary step that could have serious political and personal consequences. However, Margaret's orders came directly from the highest levels of the royal household, indicating the gravity of the situation. They made their way through the palace corridors, moving as discreetly as possible to avoid attracting attention from other staff members. The guest wing was typically quieter than the main palace, with only essential personnel having access. Margaret used her master key to enter Queen Camilla's private suite. The rooms were elegantly appointed but felt impersonal compared to the late Queen's lived-in study. They began their search in the bedroom, checking the obvious places where jewelry might be stored. Sarah examined the dressing table while James documented their process with photographs. It was Margaret who made the crucial discovery. In the walk-in closet, behind a row of evening gowns, she found a leather jewelry case that didn't match the standard palace inventory. The case was partially hidden behind some shoeboxes, suggesting it had been deliberately concealed. "Sarah, James, you need to see this," Margaret called quietly. When they gathered around, she carefully opened the case to reveal 4 of the missing pieces, each nestled in individual silk-lined compartments. The pearl necklace lay coiled like a sleeping snake, the emerald brooch catching the light from the overhead fixture. Sarah gasped audibly before catching herself. "These are definitely from the late Queen's collection. I can verify each piece against our detailed photographs and descriptions." She began taking pictures with her tablet, ensuring every angle was documented. James worked methodically with his professional camera, capturing high-resolution images that would serve as evidence. The serial numbers and unique characteristics of each piece were clearly visible, leaving no doubt about their identity and origin. "Where are the other 3 missing pieces?" Margaret wondered aloud, continuing to search the closet. They found 2 more items in a smaller jewelry box tucked behind some handbags, but one valuable piece remained unaccounted for. As they prepared to leave the suite, Margaret's phone buzzed again. This time the message was more urgent. The king's private secretary wanted an immediate report on their findings, and King Charles himself was requesting a briefing within the hour. The team returned to the security office to compile their evidence and prepare their report. Sarah worked on updating the official inventory with detailed notes about each missing piece and where it was found. James organized his photographs into a comprehensive digital file that would serve as irrefutable documentation. Margaret sat at her desk, staring at the evidence before her. In her 25 years of palace security work, she had never encountered anything like this. The implications were staggering. They had discovered that the Queen had taken jewelry from the late Queen's collection without authorization and attempted to conceal it in her private quarters. "What happens now?" Thomas asked quietly. He had been waiting in the security office, understanding that his initial report had triggered a chain of events that was now beyond his control. "Now we report the facts and let others decide how to handle them," Margaret replied grimly. "But I suspect that within the next few hours, this palace is going to be dealing with the biggest internal crisis it has faced in decades." The weight of their discovery hung heavy in the air as they prepared to deliver news that would shake the royal family to its core. The emergency meeting was called for 4 p.m. in the king's private office, a room that had witnessed countless important decisions throughout British history. King Charles sat behind his father's massive oak desk, his expression unreadable as he reviewed the preliminary report Margaret had submitted an hour earlier. The evidence photographs were spread across the desk like pieces of a puzzle that painted an increasingly troubling picture. Present in the room were only the most trusted members of the royal household: Sir Edward Whitmore, the king's private secretary, Margaret Hayes, and surprisingly Princess Anne, who had driven from her estate immediately upon hearing about the situation. The atmosphere was tense, with everyone understanding that the next hour would determine how to handle what could become a major scandal. "Margaret, please walk us through exactly what your team discovered," King Charles said, his voice steady but strained. The stress of the situation was evident in the way he repeatedly adjusted his tie and the papers before him. Margaret stood and presented her findings with military precision. She began with Thomas's initial observation, moved through the inventory process, and concluded with the discovery of the jewelry in Queen Camilla's private quarters. Throughout her presentation, she stuck strictly to the facts, avoiding any speculation about motives or intentions. Princess Anne leaned forward when Margaret mentioned the specific pieces that were found. "The pearl necklace was Mother's favorite. She wore it to my wedding, to William's wedding, to countless family gatherings. It wasn't just valuable, it was deeply personal to her." Sir Edward consulted his own notes and looked up gravely. "Your Majesty, I must inform you that Queen Camilla's whereabouts this morning don't match her official schedule. She was supposed to be attending a charity luncheon in London, but the organizers have confirmed she never arrived. Her private secretary claimed she was feeling unwell." King Charles closed his eyes briefly, the weight of the situation clearly affecting him personally as well as professionally. This wasn't just about stolen jewelry. It was about trust, family relationships, and the integrity of the monarchy itself. "Have we located the 7th missing piece?" the king asked, referring to a diamond and sapphire ring that had belonged to Queen Victoria. "Not yet, Your Majesty. We've conducted a thorough search of the accessible areas, but we would need your authorization to expand our investigation further," Margaret replied carefully. Princess Anne spoke up with characteristic directness. "Charles, we need to confront Camilla directly. This can't be allowed to fester or be swept under the carpet. If she's taking Mother's jewelry without authorization, we need to understand why and ensure it stops immediately." Sir Edward cleared his throat diplomatically. "Ma'am, with respect, we need to consider the potential public relations implications. If word of this situation leaks to the press, it could be devastating for the monarchy's reputation. We should handle this internally and discreetly." "Discreetly?" Princess Anne's voice rose slightly. "My mother's jewelry has been stolen from her own study, and you want to handle it discreetly? What message does that send about accountability within this family?" King Charles raised his hand for silence, clearly torn between family loyalty and his duties as monarch. "We need to gather all the facts before we make any decisions. Margaret, I want Queen Camilla's movements today fully documented. I also want a complete security review to understand how this situation occurred without detection. Already underway, Your Majesty, Margaret replied. We're reviewing all security footage from the past week, and I've assigned additional personnel to monitor the relevant areas of the palace. The king's secure phone rang, interrupting their discussion. After a brief conversation, he hung up with a troubled expression. That was my communications director. There are rumors circulating among the palace staff about unusual security activity today. We may not have as much time to handle this privately as we hoped. Sir Edward immediately pulled out his phone. I'll contact our media relations team and have them prepare contingency statements just in case we need to get ahead of any stories. Princess Anne stood up abruptly. This is exactly what's wrong with how we handle family problems. Instead of dealing with the actual issue, we're already planning how to spin it for the press. Camilla took Mother's jewelry without permission. That's theft, regardless of her title. Anne, please, King Charles said wearily. She's my wife and your stepmother. There may be explanations we haven't considered. Perhaps she thought she had permission, or maybe she was planning to ask for authorization later. Then why hide the jewelry in her closet instead of wearing it openly or discussing it with you? Anne shot back. And why lie about her whereabouts this morning? The room fell silent as everyone contemplated the uncomfortable questions Princess Anne had raised. The evidence was clear, but the motivations and next steps remained murky. Margaret's phone buzzed with an urgent message. After reading it, she looked up with concern. Your Majesty, Queen Camilla has returned to the palace. Security reports that she went directly to her quarters and has been there for the past 30 minutes. She knows, Sir Edward said grimly. Somehow she's learned about our investigation. King Charles stood up slowly, the weight of leadership heavy on his shoulders. I need to speak with my wife privately before we proceed further. Margaret, please ensure that nothing leaves this room until I've had that conversation. Edward, clear my schedule for the rest of the evening. As the meeting began to break up, Princess Anne approached her brother. Charles, I know this is difficult, but you have to handle this properly. The institution comes before personal relationships. That's something Mother understood better than anyone. The king nodded solemnly, knowing that the next conversation with his wife would determine not just the resolution of this crisis, but potentially the future of their marriage and his reign. The palace was about to face its most challenging internal crisis in years, and the stakes couldn't be higher. King Charles walked slowly through the palace corridors toward the guest wing, each step feeling heavier than the last. In his 40 years of preparation for kingship, no training had adequately prepared him for confronting his wife about potentially stealing his mother's jewelry. The weight of the crown had never felt more burdensome than in this moment. He paused outside Queen Camilla's private sitting room, hearing the soft sound of classical music playing within. Through the partially open door, he could see her silhouette by the window, staring out at the palace gardens. She appeared calm, but her rigid posture suggested she was expecting this conversation. Camilla, he said softly as he entered the room, closing the door behind him. The click of the latch seemed to echo in the sudden silence as she turned off the music. Charles, she replied, turning to face him. Her expression was unreadable, but he noticed her hands were trembling slightly. I suppose you've come about the jewelry. Her immediate acknowledgement of the situation caught him off guard. He had prepared for denials, explanations, even anger, but not this calm admission. So you know about the investigation? One of the housekeeping staff mentioned unusual security activity around my quarters. It wasn't difficult to piece together, Camilla said, moving to sit in one of the antique chairs. I've been waiting for you to come. Charles sat across from her, maintaining the formal distance that had characterized too many of their important conversations. Camilla, I need you to help me understand what happened this morning. The security team found several of my mother's jewelry pieces in your possession. She was quiet for a long moment, her fingers nervously playing with her wedding ring. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely above a whisper. I never intended for it to go this far. I needed to feel closer to her. Closer to my mother, Charles asked, confusion evident in his voice. But you and she had your difficulties. You rarely spoke about wanting any connection to her memory. Camilla's composure began to crack and tears formed in her eyes. That's exactly the problem, Charles. For years she represented everything I could never be. The perfect queen. The beloved mother-in-law, the woman the public wished you had married instead of me. After she died, I kept thinking about all the conversations we never had, all the bridges we never built. Charles leaned forward, beginning to understand the emotional complexity behind her actions. So you took her jewelry because I wanted to understand her better. I thought if I could hold the things she treasured, wear the pieces that were important to her, maybe I could feel some connection to the woman who gave birth to the man I love, Camilla explained, her voice breaking. It sounds foolish when I say it out loud, but why take them secretly? Why not ask me or discuss it with the family? Charles pressed, though his tone had softened considerably. Camilla laughed bitterly. Ask who? Ask Anne, who barely tolerates my existence. Ask you. When you still get emotional every time someone mentions your mother's belongings. I knew everyone would think I was being presumptuous or opportunistic. Charles felt a pang of guilt as he realized how isolated Camilla must have felt in her grief and desire for connection. You should have trusted me enough to have this conversation. Should I have? She challenged. When was the last time we talked about your mother without you withdrawing into yourself? When have you ever made me feel like I could measure up to her memory? The accusation stung because it contained more truth than Charles wanted to admit. In his reverence for his mother's memory, he had perhaps made it impossible for anyone, including his wife, to find their own relationship with that legacy. The pearl necklace, he said quietly. You were wearing it this morning? Camilla nodded. Just for a few minutes. I wanted to see what it felt like to wear something she had worn, to understand what made those pieces special to her. I felt ridiculous, but for just a moment I felt like maybe I could be worthy of being your wife. Camilla, you don't need my mother's jewelry to be worthy. You became queen because I chose you, because you've stood by me through everything, Charles said, reaching across to take her hand. But I'll never be her, will I? Camilla asked, the fundamental insecurity finally exposed. I'll never be the queen the public wanted. Never be the woman your children truly accept. Never be worthy of the legacy I'm supposed to continue. Charles was quiet for several minutes, processing not just her actions but the deep emotional pain that had driven them. You're right that you'll never be my mother. But you're also someone she never was. You're the woman I chose to love and marry. That should be enough. Is it enough for you? Camilla asked directly. Because sometimes I wonder if you married me despite who I am rather than because of who I am. The question hung in the air between them, cutting to the heart of issues that had remained unspoken throughout their marriage. Charles realized that this crisis was about much more than stolen jewelry. It was about identity, acceptance, and the complex dynamics of a royal family dealing with grief and change. We need to return the jewelry, he said finally, and we need to find a way to handle this situation that protects both the institution and our marriage. Camilla nodded, understanding that the personal conversation, as important as it was, couldn't resolve the practical crisis they now faced. What happens next? Next, we face this together, Charles replied, though he wasn't entirely sure what that would mean for either of them. The palace corridors buzzed with nervous energy as word of the crisis spread through the senior staff. By evening, key members of the royal household had been quietly briefed on the situation, and emergency protocols were being discreetly implemented to manage what could potentially become a major scandal. In the communications office, Director Sarah Phillips worked frantically with her team to prepare multiple response scenarios. Press statements were drafted for various outcomes, from misunderstanding resolved internally to more serious damage control measures. The monarchy's reputation hung in the balance, and every word would be scrutinized by media outlets worldwide. Meanwhile, Margaret Hayes found herself at the center of an increasingly complex situation. Additional security measures had been implemented throughout the palace, and she was fielding calls from various royal residences as news of the incident spread through official channels. The king's private secretary had made it clear that absolute discretion was required while they worked toward a resolution. Thomas Mitchell, the guard whose initial observation had triggered this crisis, was quietly reassigned to different duties to remove him from the immediate situation. However, his detailed written report had become a crucial piece of evidence that would need to be carefully managed, regardless of how the situation was ultimately resolved. At 7 p.m., an unprecedented family meeting was convened in the king's private dining room. Present were King Charles, Queen Camilla, Princess Anne, Prince William, and Sir Edward Whitmore. The absence of other family members was deliberate. Only those essential to resolving the crisis were included. Queen Camilla entered the room with obvious reluctance, her usual confident demeanor replaced by visible anxiety. She had changed into a simple black dress and wore no jewelry whatsoever, a detail that didn't go unnoticed by anyone present. The missing pieces had been quietly returned to the security office earlier that afternoon. "Before we begin," King Charles announced, "I want everyone to understand that this conversation stays within these walls. We're here as a family to resolve a family matter." Princess Anne's expression suggested she disagreed with characterizing theft as merely a family matter, but she remained silent for the moment. Prince William appeared uncomfortable with the entire situation, clearly struggling between his role as future king and his position as someone who had deeply loved his grandmother. Sir Edward presented a summary of the facts as they had been established. 7 pieces of jewelry taken without authorization, concealed in private quarters, and discovered during a routine security investigation. The clinical presentation of events made them sound even more serious in the formal setting. "Camilla," Princess Anne said directly, "we need to hear from you exactly what happened and why." Queen Camilla looked around the table before beginning to speak. Her voice steady despite her obvious nervousness. She repeated much of what she had shared with Charles earlier about feeling disconnected from the late Queen's memory and wanting to understand her better through her personal possessions. Prince William listened intently, his expression softening slightly as she explained her emotional motivations. "I can understand wanting to feel close to Granny," he said quietly. "But taking her things without permission, it feels like a violation of her memory." "That wasn't my intention," Camilla replied, tears beginning to form in her eyes. "I know how this looks, and I know I handled it wrong. I should have spoken to Charles or to all of you about how I was feeling. The problem is more than just the emotional aspect," Sir Edward interjected diplomatically. "We have security protocols that were violated, staff members who witnessed unauthorized activity, and a paper trail that documents everything. Even if this remains internal, we need to address the systemic issues this has exposed." Princess Anne leaned forward. "The real issue is trust. How can any of us trust that this won't happen again? How can the staff trust that royal property is secure? How can the public trust us if this ever becomes known?" "Anne's right about the trust issue," Prince William added. "But we also need to consider what Granny would have wanted. She valued family unity above almost everything else. She wouldn't want this to destroy our relationships with each other." King Charles had remained largely silent, allowing the family to express their concerns and perspectives. Finally, he spoke up. "We need to find a path forward that addresses everyone's concerns while protecting both Camilla and the institution." "What are you proposing?" Princess Anne asked skeptically. "First, Camilla will meet with each family member individually to discuss how to honor the late Queen's memory in ways that feel appropriate to everyone. Second, we'll implement new protocols for accessing and managing the late Queen's personal effects. Third, Camilla will take on additional charitable work related to causes that were important to my mother." Queen Camilla looked surprised by the proposal but nodded her agreement. "I want to make this right, whatever it takes." Sir Edward consulted his notes. "From an institutional perspective, we'll need to conduct a complete security review and ensure that all staff members involved understand the confidential nature of this situation. We'll also need to establish new procedures for family access to royal collections. And if this leaks to the press?" Prince William asked the question everyone was thinking. "Then we tell the truth," King Charles replied firmly. "That a family member made an error in judgment, we addressed it internally and we've implemented measures to prevent similar situations in the future. We emphasized that no laws were broken and no public property was involved." Princess Anne remained skeptical, but seemed to accept that the proposed solution was better than the alternatives. "I want it understood that this level of flexibility isn't available for future incidents. We can't set a precedent that royal status provides immunity from consequences." "Agreed," King Charles said solemnly. "This is a one-time resolution based on unique circumstances." As the meeting concluded, each family member understood that they were participants in a delicate balancing act between justice, mercy, and institutional preservation. The next few days would determine whether their chosen path would strengthen or weaken the bonds that held both the family and the monarchy together. The palace had survived many crises throughout its history, but few had required such careful navigation between personal relationships and public responsibilities. 3 weeks after the crisis, Buckingham Palace had settled into a new rhythm that reflected the lessons learned from those turbulent days. The late Queen's study had been transformed into a proper memorial space, with guided access for family members and a formal process for handling her personal effects. The changes were subtle but significant, representing a more open approach to honoring her memory. Thomas Mitchell had been quietly commended for his professionalism and attention to duty. Though the commendation would never appear in any public record, his actions had potentially prevented a much larger crisis by ensuring the situation was discovered and addressed before it could spiral out of control. He continued his duties with the same dedication, though he now understood that even routine patrols could have extraordinary consequences. Margaret, Hayes had implemented comprehensive new security protocols that balanced family privacy with institutional protection. The changes included better documentation procedures, enhanced monitoring systems, and clearer guidelines for staff when they encountered unusual situations involving family members. Her handling of the crisis had earned her recognition from the highest levels of the royal household. Queen Camilla had indeed begun meeting individually with family members to discuss ways to honor the late Queen's memory. Her conversation with Prince William had been particularly meaningful, resulting in a joint initiative to support one of his grandmother's favorite charities. With Princess Anne, she had established a more formal but respectful relationship based on shared commitment to royal duties rather than forced personal affection. The missing jewelry had been properly catalogued and secured, with several pieces designated for display in the new memorial space. Ironically, the crisis had led to a more thoughtful and organized approach to preserving the late Queen's legacy than had existed before. Some pieces were selected for rotation among family members, creating the connection that Camilla had originally sought through more appropriate channels. Sir Edward Whitmore had successfully managed the media aspects of the situation, with no leaks reaching the public despite the number of people who had been involved in the investigation. The palace's reputation for discretion and internal problem-solving had been enhanced rather than damaged, though everyone understood how differently things could have turned out. King Charles had perhaps changed the most through the experience. His conversations with Camilla had opened discussions about their relationship that had been long overdue. They had begun couples counseling with a discreet therapist who specialized in high-profile relationships, working to address the underlying issues that had contributed to the crisis. The most important thing we learned, King Charles told his private secretary during a review meeting, is that even in a family that lives in the public eye, we can't ignore the private emotional needs of our members. Camilla felt isolated and unworthy, and that drove her to make poor choices. The palace staff had also benefited from the experience. New training programs had been implemented to help them navigate the complex dynamics of serving a family that was both private individuals and public institutions. The incident had reminded everyone that behind the titles and ceremonies were real people dealing with real emotions and conflicts. Princess Anne had maintained her position that accountability was essential, but she had also acknowledged that the family's response had been measured and appropriate. "We handled it like adults," she told a trusted friend. "We addressed the problem, implemented solutions, and moved forward without destroying relationships or reputations." The broader implications of the crisis extended beyond the immediate family. The incident had highlighted the ongoing challenges of modernizing an ancient institution while preserving its dignity and traditions. It had also demonstrated that even the most privileged families face the same fundamental issues of communication, acceptance, and belonging that affect everyone. For Queen Camilla, the experience had been transformative in unexpected ways. Rather than feeling more excluded from the royal family, she had found her place within it through honest conversation and shared commitment to the institution's welfare. The jewelry she had taken in search of connection had been replaced by genuine relationships built on mutual respect and understanding. 6 months later, when the palace released its annual report on charitable activities, it included a new section highlighting collaborative efforts between family members to honor the late Queen's memory. The public saw these initiatives as natural expressions of family unity and royal dedication, never knowing how close the institution had come to a crisis that could have damaged it irreparably. Thomas Mitchell, walking his patrol route through the same corridors where he had made his fateful discovery, reflected on how a single moment of alertness had contributed to protecting something much larger than jewelry, or even individual reputations. He had helped preserve the stability of an institution that millions of people looked to for continuity and tradition in an uncertain world. The palace continued its eternal function as both a home and a symbol, but now with a deeper understanding of the delicate balance required to maintain both roles successfully. The crisis had ended not with punishment or public scandal, but with growth, understanding, and a renewed commitment to the values that made the monarchy worth preserving. In the end, the greatest treasure that had been protected was not any piece of jewelry, but the trust and relationships that held the royal family together through both triumph and crisis.